The early morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the skyline of Washington, D.C., casting a warm glow over the bustling streets. The faint hum of traffic, mixed with the rhythm of hurried footsteps, painted the familiar soundtrack of the city waking up. 14-year-old Emily Parker tightened the straps of her slightly worn-out backpack and adjusted her hoodie against the crisp autumn breeze. Her breath formed little clouds in the cool air as she descended the steps into the subway station. The station was alive with energy. Business professionals in sharp suits gripped their coffee cups, college students clutched textbooks, and tired parents wrangled their toddlers. Emily navigated the crowd with practiced precision, her sneakers tapping lightly against the concrete floor. Despite the chaos, there was a quiet sense of order, an unspoken rhythm among the commuters. She glanced at her phone. 7:45 a.m., right on time. The distant rumble of the arriving train grew louder, vibrating through the steel beams of the platform. Emily pulled her earbuds from her hoodie pocket, but instead of pressing play on her favorite playlist, she paused and looked around. There was something grounding about these brief moments, watching people from all walks of life share the same fleeting space. The train screeched into the station, its metallic body reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and a wave of warm, stale air rushed out. Emily stepped inside, her small frame weaving seamlessly through the tangle of backpacks, briefcases, and shopping bags. She glanced around the crowded car, her sharp eyes scanning for an empty seat. Most were already taken. A businessman typing feverishly on his laptop, a teenage girl scrolling through her phone, and an elderly woman knitting with careful focus. But then, tucked between two strangers, she spotted it, a single empty seat. Her heart lifted for a brief second as she began to make her way toward it. Maybe today won't be so bad after all, she thought. But as she approached, her steps slowed. The seat wasn't exactly empty. It was blocked by a woman's oversized leather purse. Emily hesitated, her eyes flicking from the purse to the woman and back again. The woman, Karen, sat stiffly with her arms crossed, her face partially hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses. Emily swallowed hard, mustering her courage. She had been taught to be polite, to speak up for herself when necessary. With a small, hesitant smile, she took a step forward and gently said, "Excuse me, ma'am, may I please sit there?" The sound of her voice, soft but steady, seemed to ripple through the air. For a moment, everything felt still. The chatter of the subway car dimmed, and all eyes seemed to shift toward Emily and the woman with the purse. And in that moment, the wheels of an ordinary morning began to turn toward something extraordinary. Emily stood still, her small hand clutching the strap of her backpack, her voice still lingering in the air. "Excuse me, ma'am. May I please sit there?" The subway car, though still filled with movement and chatter, seemed to quiet ever so slightly in anticipation. The woman, Karen, turned her head slowly, her sunglasses reflecting the faint overhead lights. Her lips, painted in a shade of muted red, pressed into a thin line. For a moment, it seemed as though she might respond with a simple yes, sliding her oversized leather purse aside and allowing Emily to sit down. But instead, she shifted her body slightly and clutched the purse tighter, as though protecting some precious artifact. "This seat is occupied," Karen said flatly, her voice sharp enough to slice through the low murmur of the train car. Emily blinked, her brows knitting together in confusion. She glanced again at the empty seat, clearly unoccupied, except for the purse. Her voice wavered slightly as she tried again. "I'm sorry, but it looks empty. I just need a place to sit for the ride." Karen let out a small, humorless laugh under her breath. "Sweetheart, maybe you should learn to stand like everyone else. You're young, you'll survive." Emily's cheeks flushed a deep pink as embarrassment and frustration crept in. Around her, a few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, stealing furtive glances at the unfolding interaction. A man in a navy blazer adjusted his tie while avoiding eye contact. A young mother clutched her toddler a little closer. For a brief moment, Emily considered walking away. She could find a corner to lean against or simply stand until her stop arrived. But something inside her, a quiet yet resolute voice, told her not to let this moment pass in silence. It's just a seat," Emily said softly, her voice barely audible over the rattling of the subway tracks. But Karen was already turning her head away, dismissing the conversation entirely. The woman's posture stiffened further, her jaw set as though she had just won some invisible argument. The tension in the air felt almost tangible now. It hung heavy between Emily and Karen, stretching outward to the rest of the passengers, who now watched with cautious curiosity. Emily took a small step back, her sneakers making a faint squeak against the train's grimy floor. Her wide eyes darted briefly around the car, meeting a few sympathetic faces. An older gentleman with graying hair, a young college student clutching a sketch pad, and a woman in a bright red scarf who was frowning deeply in Karen's direction. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel tracks and the occasional crackle of the PA system overhead. And yet, amid the unspoken discomfort, Emily stood firm, her slender shoulders squared, her chin lifted just slightly. She wasn't angry, nor was she aggressive. She was simply there, a small figure in a big world, holding her ground with quiet dignity. In that stillness, something unspoken passed between Emily and the strangers around her. A shared understanding, a shared disappointment. But Karen remained unmoved, her sunglasses acting like an impenetrable wall between her and the world. The train continued its journey into the morning rush, but something had already shifted in that small corner of the subway car. The ordinary morning was beginning to feel anything but ordinary. The rhythmic clatter of the subway wheels filled the silence left hanging between Emily and Karen. Emily stood rooted in place, her backpack still slung over one shoulder, her face carefully composed despite the sting of rejection. Karen remained motionless, her sunglasses a cold, mirrored wall between her and the world around her. But the silence didn't last long. From across the aisle, a man in his early 40s cleared his throat. He wore a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt and had dark circles under his eyes, the kind earned from too many long nights and too little sleep. His voice was steady, but tinged with disappointment. "Ma'am," he said, leaning slightly forward, "the kid just asked for a seat. She wasn't rude about it. Was that really necessary?" Karen shifted slightly, but didn't respond. Another voice joined in, a woman with curly brown hair and a bright red scarf wrapped snugly around her neck. Her eyes, sharp and compassionate, flicked toward Emily before returning to Karen. "You know," the woman said with a touch of restrained frustration, "it's not even about the seat anymore. It's about how you spoke to her. She's just a kid." The energy in the subway car shifted again, the quiet hum of passive observation giving way to active engagement. Passengers who had previously buried their faces in their phones or stared blankly at their reflections in the subway windows began to pay closer attention. Emily stood frozen in place, her feet planted firmly on the grimy subway floor. She wasn't sure if she felt comforted or embarrassed by the strangers speaking up on her behalf. Her eyes flitted nervously from the man to the woman, then back to Karen. Karen let out a sigh, loud and exaggerated, as if the entire situation had been thrust upon her without her consent. She adjusted her sunglasses slightly, revealing the sharp curve of her brow. "I don't need parenting advice from strangers on a train," she said curtly, her voice slicing through the growing tension. "I said the seat is occupied. End of story." The man in the wrinkled shirt shook his head slowly, his eyes softening as they met Emily's. "Sometimes, ma'am, it's not about being right. It's about being kind." The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the stale subway smell or the metallic hum of the train in motion. Emily felt her chest tighten as her emotions bubbled just beneath the surface. Confusion, embarrassment, gratitude, and something else. Something she couldn't quite name. From the far end of the car, someone pulled out a phone and aimed it subtly in Karen's direction. A small red light blinked, indicating that the confrontation was being recorded. Others noticed, their gazes flicking nervously between the phone and Karen. The subway car felt like a stage now, with Emily and Karen at its center, and the audience holding their collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But amid the crackling tension, Emily did something unexpected. Something quiet and brave. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and spoke softly but clearly. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just wanted to sit down." Her voice carried through the car, cutting through the tension like a gentle breeze through heavy fog. For a brief moment, even Karen seemed to falter. Her hand, still clutching her oversized leather purse, trembled just slightly before she tightened her grip once more. The train jolted slightly as it sped toward the next station, but the emotional stillness within the car remained unbroken. Emily stayed standing, her shoulders squared, her head held high. And though she was still just a young girl in a crowded subway car, in that moment she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone far beyond her years. The subway car rattled along the tracks, but inside, time felt like it had slowed. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the stale, metallic-scented air. Emily remained standing, her slender shoulders squared, her face calm yet etched with quiet determination. Karen, still clutching her oversized purse like a shield, remained steadfast, her lips pressed into a tight, unyielding line. The man in the wrinkled shirt let out a soft sigh and leaned back in his seat. His earlier words, "It's not about being right, it's about being kind," still lingered in the air. But now, another voice emerged from the opposite end of the car. A young woman in her late 20s, with caramel curls framing her face and a tote bag resting on her lap, spoke up. Her voice was clear, carrying a mix of frustration and compassion. "You know, this isn't about the seat anymore." She paused, her eyes flicking between Karen and Emily. "It's about how you're treating her. She's just trying to get to school, and you're acting like she doesn't matter." Karen shifted in her seat, her sunglasses slipping slightly down her nose. For the first time, her eyes, cold, tired, and perhaps a little defensive, were partially visible. "I don't owe anyone anything," she said curtly. "Not her, not you, not anyone on this train." Her words struck like cold metal against stone. The air in the subway car grew heavier still. Emily's fingers twitched around the strap of her backpack. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their quiet support mixed with a shared discomfort at the brewing confrontation. At that moment, a young man with a camera phone raised his arm slightly higher, ensuring he captured every angle of the interaction. The red recording light glowed faintly, unnoticed by Karen, but seen by nearly everyone else. The older woman in the red scarf who had spoken earlier let out a small, audible sigh before turning to Emily. Her voice softened as she spoke, her words carrying a warmth that cut through the tension. "Honey, don't let this make you feel small. You did nothing wrong." Emily gave her a small nod, her lips pressing together as if holding back a wave of emotion. But Karen's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Why does everyone think they can gang up on me? You don't know me. You don't know what kind of morning I've had. Maybe I just want to be left alone." Her voice wavered slightly on the last word, and for the first time, cracks appeared in her rigid demeanor. The sunglasses came off completely as Karen rubbed her temples, her frustration boiling just beneath the surface. For a brief second, the subway car went silent again, the weight of Karen's words settling over everyone like dust on forgotten furniture. Emily, still clutching her backpack strap, spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "I'm sorry if you've had a hard morning. I wasn't trying to bother you. I just thought maybe you didn't notice the seat was empty." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. A child's voice cutting through an adult's storm of defensiveness and exhaustion. Karen froze. Her shoulders sagged ever so slightly, and she turned her head away, staring blankly at the passing tunnel lights outside the subway window. The man with the camera phone lowered it slightly, as if sensing that the moment had shifted. The confrontation wasn't over, but some fragile thread of understanding had been stretched between Emily and Karen. The subway doors hissed open at the next stop, and a handful of passengers shuffled off. But no one moved from the immediate vicinity of the scene. They remained anchored there, bound by a collective need to see how this moment would resolve. As the train jolted forward once again, the tension remained thick, but the air carried with it something else, something softer, more fragile. For Emily, it was the first glimmer of hope. For Karen, it was the first crack in a wall she'd spent years building. And for everyone else in that subway car, it was the realization that small moments like this, raw, uncomfortable, and real, could echo far beyond the steel walls of a morning commute. The subway train continued its steady rhythm, the metal wheels clanging against the tracks in a monotonous hum. Inside the car, the tension still hung heavy, like a fog refusing to lift. Emily remained standing, her small shoulders squared but trembling slightly under the weight of so many staring eyes. Across from her, Karen stayed rigid in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest and her oversized purse still stubbornly occupying the empty seat beside her. The woman in the red scarf had moved closer to Emily, her expression filled with a mix of frustration and compassion. She glanced briefly at Karen before turning back to the young girl. "Sweetheart, you can sit here, please." The kindness in her voice was like a balm against the raw edges of the moment. Emily hesitated, her wide eyes flicking between the offered seat and Karen's rigid posture. But before she could move, a man's voice cut through the uneasy silence. "This is ridiculous." It was the man in the wrinkled shirt, the same one who had spoken up earlier. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen too many moments like this, where simple kindness was swallowed by pride and defensiveness. "She's just a kid. You couldn't move your purse for 2 seconds? Do you even hear yourself?" Karen's head snapped up, her eyes now fully visible without the barrier of her sunglasses. They were sharp, defensive, but somewhere behind the hardness, there was something else, fatigue, maybe even regret. "You don't know me," Karen said, her voice cracking slightly. "You don't know what kind of day I've had, what I'm dealing with." The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "We all have bad days, lady, but bad days aren't excuses to be unkind." Emily shifted uncomfortably, clutching the strap of her backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor, to somehow reverse time and step into another subway car altogether. From the far corner, the faint glow of a phone screen caught Emily's eye. Someone was recording again. The red light blinked steadily, capturing every word, every glance, every tremor in Karen's voice, and every flicker of fear in Emily's eyes. The woman in the red scarf spoke again, her voice low but firm. "You know, this isn't about who's right or who's wrong anymore. It's about how we treat people, and right now, all this little girl wanted was a place to sit." Karen's gaze fell to her lap, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. For a brief moment, the mask of stubbornness cracked and something raw and vulnerable peeked through. Emily finally stepped back, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It's okay. I can stand." But before anyone could react, another voice, soft, gentle, but resolute, broke through the heavy silence. "No, sweetheart. You deserve to sit." It was an older woman, her silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, her hands folded delicately on her lap. With quiet strength, she rose from her seat and gestured for Emily to take her place. Emily hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. But then, slowly, she stepped forward and sat down. The warmth of the seat beneath her felt like both a comfort and a burden, the weight of the moment still heavy on her small shoulders. Karen's eyes flickered briefly toward Emily, then back down to her lap. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. The man with the phone lowered his camera slightly, his brow furrowed as he looked at the screen. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a story unfolding in real time, one that carried far more weight than anyone in that subway car could have anticipated. The subway lurched forward again, the lights flickering briefly overhead. The woman in the red scarf gave Emily a gentle smile before stepping back into her corner. Emily let out a shaky breath and whispered a soft, almost imperceptible, "Thank you." But even as the car settled into a quieter rhythm, the ripples of the moment continued to spread, subtle but unstoppable, like cracks forming in a frozen lake. Somewhere deep inside Karen, something was beginning to shift. And somewhere deep inside Emily, something strong and unyielding had taken root. The subway car continued its relentless journey, its metallic wheels clattering rhythmically against the tracks. Yet inside, the tension remained. A fragile web stretched thin between Emily, Karen, and the silent audience of commuters. Emily stood quietly, her backpack still clutched tightly to her chest. Her face, though calm, carried the weight of something unspoken, a mixture of resilience and sadness. Across from her, Karen stared blankly out the window, her sunglasses now tucked into her oversized purse. And then, like a candle flickering in the dark, a voice broke the silence. "Hey, sweetheart, come sit here." It was the woman in the bright red scarf. Her warm smile cut through the icy stillness like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. She stood, clutching the silver pole beside her seat, and gestured for Emily to take her place. Emily hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Karen, whose eyes remained fixed on the window. Then she looked at the woman and gave a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," Emily said softly, her voice trembling slightly. As Emily slid into the now empty seat, a collective breath seemed to pass through the subway car. Passengers shifted in their seats, their shoulders relaxing slightly. It wasn't much, but it felt like something, a small victory in an otherwise heavy moment. Karen, however, remained unmoved. Her shoulders were tense, her lips pursed, and her knuckles white as they gripped the strap of her purse. At the far end of the car, the man with the phone adjusted his grip, ensuring that every second of the interaction was still being recorded. The small red light blinked steadily as the camera captured Emily's quiet gratitude, Karen's rigid posture, and the subtle shifts in the expressions of the other passengers. The subway doors hissed open again, and a few more people stepped off. A man in a navy peacoat passed Emily as he exited, pausing briefly to offer her a nod of encouragement. Emily smiled faintly in return. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The woman in the red scarf, now standing, leaned slightly toward Karen. Her voice was gentle but firm, her words carrying the weight of maternal wisdom. "You know, kindness doesn't cost you anything. You might want to remember that." Karen's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She remained facing forward, her reflection staring back at her in the smudged subway window. For Emily, the seat was a relief, a physical one, yes, but also an emotional one. It felt like a shield, a reprieve from the invisible storm that had been brewing around her. She sank into it quietly, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes staring down at her sneakers. The train jolted slightly as it picked up speed, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Outside the window, the darkness of the tunnel rushed by in a blur. But inside the car, the camera was still rolling. The man with the phone lowered it slightly, glancing down at the screen to make sure the recording was still intact. His brow furrowed as he scrolled briefly through the footage. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew. This wasn't just a fleeting subway moment. This was something larger, something that would ripple far beyond the steel confines of this train car. And somewhere deep inside Karen, though she remained silent and unyielding, a small crack had begun to form, a hairline fracture in the wall she had built so carefully around herself. The subway car pressed on into the dark tunnels, carrying with it a story that was still unfolding. The subway doors slid open with a familiar hiss, and passengers poured out into the station like water through a narrow crack. Emily remained seated, her small frame barely filling the space. She adjusted her backpack on her lap, her gaze fixed downward at the scuffed toes of her sneakers. The woman in the red scarf had moved further down the car, leaving Emily in a pocket of uneasy quiet. Karen, still clutching her oversized purse, refused to meet anyone's eyes. The tension clung to her shoulders like a weight she couldn't shake. Yet, beneath her rigid posture, something unspoken flickered. Guilt, embarrassment, or perhaps just exhaustion. The man with the phone, now standing near the door, glanced down at the screen in his hand. His thumb hovered over the share button. With a quick breath, he pressed it. The video uploaded almost instantly, the glowing progress bar filling with silent finality. In the vast expanse of the internet, things move quickly. By the time the subway pulled into the next station, the video had already begun to spread, first among friends, then to strangers, and finally to the wildfire of public outrage that only social media can fuel. In an office miles away, a woman sipped her coffee while scrolling through her phone during her lunch break. Her thumb paused over a headline, "Teen girl denied seat by woman on subway. Kindness is free." At a college dorm across town, a group of students huddled around a laptop, watching the video play on repeat. "This is awful," one of them muttered. "How can someone act like that toward a kid?" Notifications pinged, comments poured in, and hashtags sprang up overnight. #subway standoff, be like Emily, kindness matters. Meanwhile, Emily was unaware of the storm building outside the subway walls. She stepped off at her stop, her sneakers landing softly on the platform. The chill of the morning had given way to the crisp bite of midday air. She adjusted her backpack and headed toward her school, trying to shake off the weight of the interaction. But for Karen, the fallout came swiftly. Her phone buzzed in her purse, notification after notification lighting up the screen. Coworkers sent her links, friends sent her texts laced with thinly veiled judgment. The footage, now looped endlessly online, was inescapable. At first she ignored it. She told herself it was just strangers with nothing better to do. But then came the emails, the calls, and the side glances at work. Her daughter, a teenager herself, sent her a single text. "Mom, is this you?" The words felt heavier than they should have, their weight pressing down on Karen's chest until she could barely breathe. She stared at her reflection in the darkened subway window that morning, and now at the glow of her phone screen. In both reflections, she saw the same thing, a version of herself she wasn't sure she recognized anymore. Karen sank onto her couch that night, her phone still buzzing beside her. The comments online were brutal. Heartless. How can someone treat a kid like that? Disgraceful. But mixed in with the anger, there were quieter voices, softer ones. We've all had bad days. It's never too late to apologize. Karen's hand hovered over her phone screen. She clicked on the video, watching herself. The sunglasses, the tight purse grip, the dismissive tone. And then she watched Emily, standing there, small yet unyielding, her voice calm but steady. Tears welled in Karen's eyes as she realized something. Emily had shown more maturity and grace in that moment than she had managed in years. Back at home, Emily sat at her desk, chewing the end of a pencil as she stared at her unfinished homework. Her phone buzzed beside her, messages from friends, notifications from strangers, and a flood of well-wishers. One message stood out. "You were brave today, Emily. Never forget that." Her chest tightened, and a small smile crept onto her lips. But deep inside, Emily felt something she couldn't quite articulate, a discomfort with all the attention. She hadn't asked to become a symbol or a viral sensation. She had just wanted a seat on the subway. She set her phone down and sighed, staring out her bedroom window at the sprawling lights of the city. Somewhere out there, Karen was staring at her own window, carrying her own invisible weight. In different corners of the same city, two people sat with their thoughts, one reflecting on her mistakes, the other grappling with unexpected fame. And yet, despite the distance between them, the ripples of their brief encounter were still spreading outward, touching lives in ways neither of them could fully understand. The city buzzed with a restless energy as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows over the crowded streets. In her small apartment, Karen sat curled on her couch, her phone clutched in her trembling hands. The glow of the screen illuminated her tired face, reflecting rows of comments, some angry, some scathing, and others offering hesitant compassion. Her inbox overflowed with emails, her employer, concerned clients, even distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years. The video had reached every corner of her life. It wasn't just strangers anymore. It was her coworkers, her friends, and most painfully, her daughter. The text still lingered in her mind. "Mom, is this you?" Karen had avoided answering. How could she explain to her daughter the woman she'd seen in that video? The one with cold sunglasses and a tight grip on her purse, dismissing a child with words that dripped with indifference? At work the next morning, the usual hum of office chatter dimmed when Karen walked in. Heads turned slightly, conversations paused mid-sentence. Her manager called her into his office, a sterile space with corporate artwork and the faint scent of coffee. He spoke calmly, his tone professional but firm. "Karen, this video, it's everywhere. Clients are asking questions. Our company has values, and I need to know what happened." Karen's throat tightened as she tried to explain how she'd been tired, how her morning had started poorly, how she hadn't meant for it to escalate. But every word felt hollow, and every excuse tasted bitter on her tongue. Her manager sighed, rubbing his temples. "Take some time off. Reflect on this. We'll revisit this conversation soon." The walk back to her desk felt impossibly long, the weight of every stare, every glance, pressed down on her shoulders. Meanwhile, across town, Emily sat in her school cafeteria, surrounded by classmates who now seemed to look at her differently. Her phone buzzed nonstop in her pocket. News outlets requesting interviews, strangers sending praise, and classmates offering awkward high fives. One of her friends leaned over, grinning. "Emily, you're like famous now. Everyone's talking about you. You stood up to that woman. It was epic." Emily forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She didn't feel epic. She felt exposed. She hadn't asked for this spotlight, hadn't asked to become a viral moment. She just wanted to get to school, to have a seat on the subway like everyone else. The attention felt heavy, like wearing a backpack full of stones. Later that evening, as Emily sat cross-legged on her bed, she scrolled through the endless flood of comments and messages. Praise and anger, kindness and cruelty, all mixed together in a cacophony of noise. Her mom knocked softly on the bedroom door before stepping inside. "Hey, sweetheart, you doing okay?" Emily hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. I just don't know why everyone's making such a big deal about it. I wasn't trying to be brave. I just wanted to sit down." Her mom sat beside her, wrapping an arm around Emily's shoulders. Sometimes the smallest moments have the biggest ripples. You didn't ask for this, but people saw something in you. A quiet strength, a kindness, that matters. Emily leaned into her mom's embrace, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. At her own apartment, Karen sat by her kitchen table, staring at the blinking cursor on her phone screen. A blank text message stared back at her, addressed to her daughter. She typed and deleted again. Finally, her fingers settled on a single sentence. "I'm sorry. I'm not proud of who I was in that moment, but I'm trying to understand why I acted that way." She hesitated, then pressed send. Her phone buzzed a moment later with a reply. "That's a start, Mom." Tears welled in Karen's eyes as she set the phone down, her hands shaking. It wasn't absolution, but it was something, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. Outside her window, the city lights flickered against the darkening sky, and for the first time in days, Karen allowed herself to exhale. In different corners of the same city, Emily and Karen sat quietly with their thoughts, one grappling with unwanted attention, the other wrestling with her own reflection. But in that stillness, something began to shift, a fragile but undeniable glimmer of change. The city glimmered under the soft golden haze of early evening as Karen sat at her kitchen table, her phone resting silently in front of her. The screen was blank, but the weight of 1,000 words lingered in her chest. The text exchange with her daughter had been a flicker of hope, a small crack in a dam she'd built long ago. Her eyes flicked to the viral video playing on her laptop nearby. She watched herself, rigid, cold, dismissive. Then she saw Emily, small but unyielding, her voice soft yet firm. Karen flinched at her own reflection on the screen, the version of herself she never wanted to face. For hours she sat frozen, her thoughts tangled and heavy. Then, almost without realizing it, her fingers began typing an email. Subject, an apology. Body, Dear Emily, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how I spoke to you, for how I dismissed you, and for how I let my own bad day become your burden. You didn't deserve that. No one does. I hope one day, if you're willing, I can say this to you in person. She hovered over the send button, her breath caught in her throat, and then, with a sharp exhale, she pressed it. Across town, Emily sat at her desk, her textbooks splayed open but untouched. The glow of her phone screen illuminated her face as messages and notifications continued to pour in. She scrolled mindlessly, her chest tightening with every comment. You're so brave, Emily. You're an inspiration. I hope that woman learns her lesson. But amidst the flood of messages, one new email notification appeared. The sender, Karen Parker. Emily's eyes widened as she clicked it open. She read the email once, then twice, her brows knitting together as she absorbed each word. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, just raw honesty and remorse. Her mother, standing in the doorway, noticed her expression. Everything okay, Em? Emily nodded slowly, her voice quiet. She apologized. Her mother crossed the room, sitting on the edge of Emily's bed. What do you think about that? Emily stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. I think she really means it. A few days later, the two found themselves sitting across from each other in a small cafe tucked away from the city's usual chaos. Emily sat with her hands wrapped around a warm mug of hot chocolate, her backpack slung over the back of her chair. Across from her sat Karen, her oversized purse noticeably absent, replaced by trembling hands cupped around a cup of tea. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the cafe filled the silence between them, clinking mugs, soft chatter, the hiss of steamed milk. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for agreeing to meet me, Emily. You didn't have to. Emily's eyes met Karen's, and for the first time, Karen felt the full weight of the young girl's quiet strength. "You know, you didn't have to apologize either," Emily said softly. "But you did." Karen's eyes welled with tears as she set her mug down, her hands trembling slightly. I was so wrapped up in my own problems, my own bad day, that I didn't stop to see you, not just as some random kid on the subway, but as a person. I'm so sorry for that." Emily nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Everyone has bad days, Miss Parker. But I think what matters is what we do after them." Karen let out a shaky breath, her tears finally spilling over as she nodded. The two sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the interaction settling between them. Not heavy, not sharp, but something gentler. Healing, perhaps. Before they parted, Karen reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded note. "I wrote this for you. It's not much, but it's from the heart." Emily took the note carefully, her fingers brushing against the paper. "Thank you," she said softly. As they stood to leave, Karen hesitated. "Emily, you've reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Kindness isn't weakness, it's strength." Emily smiled faintly, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "It is, and it's never too late to show it." The video had faded from viral fame by then, buried under the next wave of online outrage and fleeting trends. But the encounter between Emily and Karen left something lasting, a quiet ripple in the hearts of two people who had collided in an ordinary moment on an ordinary morning. In the days that followed, Karen began to volunteer at a local youth center, channeling her remorse into action. Emily, meanwhile, started journaling about her experience. Her words filled with a quiet wisdom that stretched far beyond her 14 years. And somewhere in the vast, noisy world, their story, quiet and deeply human, continued to echo, carrying with it a simple but profound reminder. Kindness doesn't cost a thing, but it can change everything. The days turned into weeks, and the viral video faded into the ever-churning sea of online trends. The hashtags disappeared from trending lists, the comments slowed, and the world, as it always does, moved on. But for Emily and Karen, the story was far from over. At her school, Emily sat in her English classroom, her pencil dancing over the lines of her notebook. The teacher had given the class an assignment: write about a moment that changed you. Emily hesitated, her pencil hovering over the paper. Words began to flow, slow at first, then steady, then unstoppable. She wrote about the subway, about the seat, about the silence that had spoken louder than words, and about the strength she hadn't realized she carried inside her. When she handed her paper in, her teacher read it with tears glistening in her eyes. "Emily, your words, they're powerful. Have you ever considered sharing this with more people?" Emily's cheeks flushed as she shook her head. "I didn't think anyone would care about what I have to say." The teacher smiled, placing a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "Trust me, they will." That night, Emily's mother helped her type up the essay and submit it to a local youth writing contest. Neither of them expected much, but the words carried their own quiet power, just like Emily herself. On the other side of the city, Karen stood in a brightly lit community center. The hum of chatter filled the air as children laughed and volunteers bustled around with art supplies and snacks. Karen had started volunteering there shortly after her meeting with Emily. At first, she'd been hesitant, unsure of her place, afraid of the judgment she might face. But slowly, day by day, the children's laughter chipped away at her walls. On one particular afternoon, a little girl tugged at Karen's sleeve. "Miss Karen, can you help me draw a sun? I want it to be the brightest one ever." Karen knelt down, her smile warm and unguarded. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's make it shine." In moments like these, Karen felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Later that evening, as she packed up art supplies, one of the other volunteers approached her. "You know, Karen, you're really good with these kids. They trust you." Karen's eyes softened. I think I needed this just as much as they do." The volunteer smiled knowingly. "Sometimes redemption doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in small moments, like this one." Karen nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Meanwhile, Emily's essay had quietly made its way through the layers of the contest judges. Weeks later, she received an email. "Congratulations, Emily. Your essay has been selected as the winner of the city's Youth Voice Award. We'd love for you to read it aloud at our annual community event." Emily stared at the screen, her heart racing. The night of the event arrived. The auditorium buzzed with quiet chatter as families, friends, and members of the community filled the rows of seats. Emily stood backstage, clutching a printed copy of her essay. Her mother squeezed her shoulder gently. "You've got this, sweetheart. Just speak from your heart." When Emily stepped onto the stage, her voice trembled at first. But then, she remembered the subway, the feeling of standing firm, of speaking up, and her voice grew steady. She read her essay aloud, her words painting a vivid picture of the encounter, of the discomfort, of the courage it took to speak softly in the face of indifference. In the audience, Karen sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, tears streaming silently down her face. Emily's closing words echoed through the auditorium. Kindness doesn't cost anything, but sometimes it takes courage. And sometimes the smallest moments, like asking for a seat on a subway, can remind us all of who we want to be. The audience erupted into applause, but Karen couldn't move. She felt something inside her, something heavy and unspoken, begin to lift. After the event, Karen approached Emily in the lobby. The two stood facing each other, the crowd swirling around them. "That was beautiful, Emily," Karen said, her voice trembling. Emily smiled softly. "Thank you, Miss Parker. I think we both learned something from that day." Karen nodded, her eyes glistening. "We did. And I'll keep learning, I promise." The two shared a brief but meaningful hug, a quiet moment in a crowded room, but one that carried the weight of forgiveness, growth, and hope. The video might have faded from the public eye, but the story of Emily and Karen lived on, not as a viral sensation, but as a quiet reminder shared through essays, conversations, and moments of reflection. The subway encounter had started as a spark, a brief flicker in the darkness, but it had grown into something much larger, a flame carried by two people who refused to let it die out. In the end, it wasn't about a seat on a subway. It was about the power of kindness, the courage to admit when we're wrong, and the ripple effect of one small act of bravery. The story of Emily and Karen didn't end in a viral video or a heartfelt apology. It didn't end on a subway train or a brightly lit stage. It continued to grow, quietly and persistently, like ripples spreading across the surface of a still lake. Months after the subway incident, Emily sat in her school library, her fingers tracing the edge of a certificate framed proudly on the wall. The Youth Voice Award shone under the overhead lights, a symbol of a moment that had changed her life in ways she still didn't fully understand. Nearby, a younger student approached her shyly, clutching a folded piece of paper. "Emily, I wrote about you for my class project. You're really brave." Emily smiled warmly, her heart swelling with both pride and humility. "Thank you. But you know, bravery doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's just about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." The child nodded earnestly before scampering away. Emily exhaled slowly, the weight of her journey settling over her shoulders like a familiar coat. At the community center across town, Karen stood in front of a group of kids, holding a picture book in her hands. Her voice carried warmth as she read aloud, her eyes scanning the bright, eager faces watching her. When the story ended, a little boy raised his hand. "Miss Karen, do you think people can change?" The question hung in the air for a moment, raw and unfiltered. Karen knelt down to meet his eyes, her voice soft but firm. I think people can absolutely change, but they have to want to, and they have to try. Really, really hard." The boy nodded thoughtfully, and Karen smiled. She'd learned that change wasn't a single act or apology, it was a choice made every day, in small moments, with every interaction. Later that evening, Karen closed the center and stepped outside into the crisp evening air. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from her daughter. "Proud of you, Mom. I mean it." Karen clutched the phone to her chest, her breath hitching as she looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. Emily and Karen didn't cross paths again after that day in the cafe, but their lives remained quietly intertwined. Emily continued to share her story in small ways, through her writing, her friendships, and her gentle reminders to those around her that kindness, no matter how small, matters. Karen, in turn, carried her lessons into every interaction, pausing, listening, and remembering that the weight of a moment can linger far longer than its passing. And yet, the impact of their story stretched far beyond them. A young woman on a bus remembered Emily's calm voice and decided to speak up when she saw someone being mistreated. A man who had scrolled past the viral video late at night chose patience instead of anger when confronted with rudeness the next morning. A mother shared the story with her children at bedtime, teaching them about compassion and the courage it takes to stand up, not just for yourself, but for others. One rainy afternoon, Emily stood waiting for her subway train. The station was crowded, the air damp and heavy with the scent of wet concrete. She spotted an empty seat nearby. A young boy stood hesitantly in front of it, glancing at the woman beside it, a woman with tired eyes and a heavy purse resting on the seat. Emily felt her chest tighten, a flash of memory washing over her. But then the woman caught the boy's gaze and smiled faintly. "Oh, sweetheart, let me move my bag. Please sit down." The boy beamed, sliding into the seat with a grateful nod. Emily exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as the train screeched to a stop and she stepped inside. She realized then that the story she had been a part of wasn't just hers or Karen's anymore. It belonged to everyone who had seen it, heard it, and carried its message forward. Because kindness, much like anger, can spread like wildfire. But unlike anger, kindness leaves behind warmth, light, and the possibility of something better. The story of Emily and Karen is not extraordinary because of a viral video or public attention. It is extraordinary because it reminds us of something simple and true. We all have the power to choose kindness. Every day, in every moment. And those choices, small and fleeting, can change everything. The subway train rattled into the darkness, carrying its passengers forward. And somewhere, in the quiet space between stops, another story was already beginning.